Washington Presidential Library, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's Brown Bag. And before we get started, I wanted to give you a heads up on some events that we've got coming up. Our next Brown Bag is going to be on October 8th, and it's going to feature research fellow James Lewis, who's here in the room with us today, and he's going to be presenting on his research topic, American Prime. Why Americans desired, adopted, and abandoned their own prime meridian. And our next lunch at the library, that's where you can buy a ticket and come and have a nice box lunch with us. It's going to be taking place on October 17 with Elizabeth Reese. And this is actually on the anniversary of the historic visit of Lafayette to the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit to Mount Vernon on October 17. And Elizabeth Reese has got a new book called The Marquis de Lafayette Returns, a tour of America's national capital region. And that's going to be a really nice event taking place here in this room, and it includes a buffet lunch. And on October the 2nd, we will be hosting our next Ford Evening Book Talk with historian Michael Hattem from Yale, and he's going to be here to discuss the memory of 76, the revolution in American history. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for the day. Sandra Patton-Imani received her MA and her PhD from the University of Minnesota Law School and is an associate professor at Drake University. She's authored 2 books, Birthmarks, Transracial Adoption in Contemporary America, and Queering Family Trees, Race, Reproductive Justice, and Lesbian Motherhood. Today, she will be discussing her research project, Ann Fairfax Washington Lee, Race, Gender, and Sex in the 18th Century. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sandra Patton-Imani.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I'm really excited to be here. I have not shared this research much so far. As you see, there's an electronic version, and that's part of what I intend to do with this project is I will be writing a book, but it's also going to be a digital online public history project. So this will be available, this is available now, but it will continue to evolve. This is very much tied to this talk, but it's the beginnings of what will be a much larger digital project. This is an ArcGIS story map. Some of you may be familiar with that. I have students use this for projects and so forth, so something that I really appreciate and enjoy. So let's get started. It's 1742 at Belvoir Plantation in Fairfax County, Virginia. 14-year-old Ann Fairfax has shared the secret she has carried for 5 years, that family friend Reverend Green has repeatedly attempted to debauch her. She first told a servant girl who told her not to tell anyone. Then his attempted rape escalated the situation, so she told her aunt, who told her stepmother, who told her father, William Fairfax. He's furious and writes a letter to Reverend Green, a family friend and rector at Truro Parish, saying, "Your crimes are discovered." Fairfax received an answer by letter from the said Charles, part of which he remembers to be in the following words: "I confess I have been guilty of some indiscretions with regard to Miss N," her nickname was Nancy, "which on reflection I have thought improper and for some time desisted. She is for me, Virgo intacta." Fairfax described the letter in his deposition because the said letter was burnt in order to prevent its affecting her character in the world. It's likely her father decides that marriage is the next step to ensure her reputation is unstained. On July 19th, 1743, on July 19th, 1743, Ann Fairfax, one of the most eligible young ladies in Virginia, is married to Lawrence Washington at Belvoir, her father's mansion. They marry quickly in order to establish her reputation as a proper married lady. Soon after Lawrence Washington and Ann Fairfax marry, Washington charged Reverend Charles Green, a family friend and minister at their local parish, with repeated acts of debauchery against Anne beginning when she was 9 years old and ending with an attempted rape in 1742 when Anne was 14 years old. Rather than quietly leaving the parish in shame, Greene fights back, charging Washington with slander, leading to a full ecclesiastical trial in 1745. These events affected two of the most prominent Virginia families of the 18th century. Why do we know so little about these stories? This case has been virtually ignored by scholars, with the exception of historian Peter R. Henriquez, who published an article focused on the scandal in 1992. Accepting the testimony of Reverend Greene, Henriquez argued that the cleric had committed no crime against Anne Washington. So I want to give you just show you a little bit here gives you a sense of the background here. We have a picture of Lawrence Washington. This is a conjectural image of Belvoir. Lawrence was the son of Augustine and half-brother to George. He'd recently returned from a military duty in the Caribbean in the War of Jenkins' Ear. They lived at Belvoir for a while. We're surmising that while the renovations were being done on what he had recently named Mount Vernon. So Anne was the oldest daughter of William Fairfax. He was the agent for Lord Thomas Fairfax, his cousin. The Chesapeake region, you can see here Mount Vernon and Belvoir, very close. The Fairfaxes were among the most prominent families in colonial America. This is a map of the Fairfax Proprietary, the 5 million acres that William Fairfax managed for his cousin. Upon his father's death in 1743, Lawrence inherited the home and plantation his father had built and renamed Little Hunting Creek. Lawrence renames it Mount Vernon in honor of his former military commander, begins a significant reconstruction on the modest wooden house. This is a conjectural drawing right here, and which comes from the Mount Vernon website, of what the house probably looked like before George did his renovations. And what I've done here is I've superimposed that conjectural drawing over the Edward Savage drawing. So you have a sense of how much smaller it would have been. Lawrence had been educated in England, and he updated the footprint of the house by creating a central passage and adding new rooms based on the Georgian style popular in England at that time. This conjectural drawing shows what it probably looked like. In today's talk, I explore intersections of sex, gender, race, and class in this buried history. I not only challenge the outcome of the case and academic interpretations of it, but I also critically explore questions about why this history has been buried for so long. I make an argument on two levels. Within the story, I argue that Greene was guilty, and his success in having the case dropped was grounded in his racist and sexist defense, blaming Anne for being wanton and attributing that to her mixed race status. Remember, she was 9. Greene was also charged with neglecting his parish duties and behaving in a manner unbecoming to a cleric. This case was, as Henriquez argues, about power among men, a clergyman versus the gentry. There were accusations relating to religion and politics in addition to the charge of attempted rape. Yet ultimately, the property over which they struggled was the body of a young biracial woman. On a broader level, I argue that this story can be read as an allegory, both about the power relations shaping intersections of race, sex, and class in the 18th century, and the ways that power shapes the construction of the archive, and thus the production of knowledge in the construction of history. The prominence of these two families may actually partly explain why historians have largely ignored the sex scandal. Another reason is likely Anne's mixed-race heritage. Despite historians' negligence, interwoven discourses of race, sex, and gender were indeed a driving force in the trial. One of the challenges in addressing questions of race in the 18th century is that the scientific racism of the 19th century often obscures an accurate understanding of the fluid and shifting ideologies of race in the 1700s. The version of national history most people learn, one that typically does not include stories like Ann Fairfax's, is not neutral, and the stakes are national identity and politics. Even here at Mount Vernon, where she lived with her husband Lawrence, she's nearly invisible. Celebrations of American history, like the mainstream versions we learn in school, often gloss over topics that make people uncomfortable. I mine this research for historical understanding, but even more importantly, to plumb questions about how this history has shaped aspects of contemporary life in the U.S. I draw on a theoretical framework that explores history as explores the history of the past as a history of the present. Sociologist and legal scholar David Garland explains that this framework problematizes the present by revealing the power relations upon which it depends and the contingent processes that have brought it into being. This form of analysis seeks to understand the ways power relations shape people's lived experiences, particularly those focused on bodies, such as racial identity and sex. In this analysis, Anne's body was marked by what Garland calls microphysics of power. In both the 5 years of persistent attempts she recounted and in the brutalizing language used in the trial. I draw on 150 plus pages of trial material from the ecclesiastical trial that's housed in the Library of Congress, as well as archival materials from Mount Vernon, the University of Virginia, the Huntington Library, and a number of other libraries and archives. In today's talk, I critically consider letters, interrogations, and testimonies focused on the charges of attempted rape and debauchement of Ann Fairfax Washington against Reverend Charles Green. I then explore what this story may tell us not only about the politics of sex, gender, race, and class in 1740s Virginia, but also about the way this story speaks to contemporary issues of power in the construction of history. The trial. In the spring of 1745, Lawrence Washington writes to the Reverend William Dawson, who served as chaplain of the Virginia House of Burgesses, president of William and Mary College, and rector of Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, charging Reverend Charles Green with frequent attempts to debauch the lady who is now his wife, unpeaceable behavior, and neglect of duty. Reverend Dawson writes to Reverend Green on May 4th, 1745, notifying him of Washington's accusations and assuring him that despite the flagrant nature of the charges, Mr. Washington is willing to making a public example of the Reverend, provided Green quietly moves to another parish. The tone of Dawson's letter implies that this is a generous offer. And in fact, Dawson suggests a position that is likely to become available in the Isle of Wight. He concludes his letter with the statement, quote, "You will, I persuade myself, think it more prudent to follow this advice than run the risk of being proceeded against in a judicial manner, the dangerous consequences whereof you may easily foresee." Lawrence Washington apparently did not intend to make this matter public. Rather, he sought to have the man who abused his wife removed quietly from the parish. His response to Reverend Dawson seethes with anger as he declares, "I utterly abhor and detest him, but his vile attempt on my wife, his cruelties, fraud, and lying, many of which have been raised to prejudice me, will justify me in this prosecution whereby I shall detect an ungrateful hypocrite, and by his removal or disqualification enjoy the benefit of public worship. I shall have many evidences to summon." Green responded by suing Washington for slander. Reverend Dawson seeks to persuade both sides to drop the matter, emphasizing to Washington the fact that the charges are over 3 years old is problematic. Both sides organize. Washington and Fairfax bring in other members of the parish to testify that Green had significantly neglected his parish duties, acted in a way unbecoming to a minister, harbored a parishioner's cattle without posting, defrauded a man of a tract of land, lived with a woman not his wife, and above all, as we are told, he is accused of making an attempt to debauch Ann Fairfax, now the wife of Major Washington, whilst a maid. The trial began on November 6, 1745, and ran for 15 days. It was presided over by Reverend William Dawson. The depositions were concluded on November 14th and would be published 10 days hence, and that the cause be heard on the 10th of April next. Ann Fairfax Washington is the first witness called. This is the record of her testimony. The image on the screen is the official record of her missing testimony. There are approximately 150 pages of trial documents preserved in the Library of Congress. The trial papers are not literal transcripts, but rather a collection of notes, summaries, preparatory materials, charges, petitions, and letters. Charles Green and his lawyers' voices are very prominently represented in first-person voice. No word-for-word testimonies of anyone's testimony exists. They are all summaries. We don't know who did the summaries. Original letters from Lawrence Washington and Deborah Fairfax provide significant first-person narratives to the story. Ann Fairfax Washington did testify twice, yet only the second re-examination summary is included in the papers. We know she told her story. We do not know how she felt about testifying. Was it her idea? Was it Lawrence's? Anne makes clear in her follow-up testimony that prior to her marriage, she believes it was against her father's inclinations to publish this affair, but after her marriage, she thinks it was agreeable to him. She may very well have wished to leave the matter in the past in order to avoid public attention. Or perhaps she was angry and committed to seeing Green punished for his crimes against her, as her husband clearly was. Though Anne's secondary testimony survives, it consists of responses to questions raised during the trial. Below are the only extant words of her primary testimony. As to her own knowledge, to other matters, therein contained and further saith not, Ann Washington. As to what Anne testified, it's made clear in the trial documents that her stepmother, Deborah Fairfax's testimony about the details of the attempts on Anne were nearly identical to Anne's testimony. I'd like to suggest that, as Avery Gordon says, to write stories concerning invisibilities and exclusions is to write ghost stories. Anne's testimony haunts the archive of this trial in a very literal sense. Allegorically, her story haunts the larger idea of the archive. Anne's story also haunts the lived experience of countless girls and women in the almost 300 years since she publicly told her story. Her stepmother, Deborah, gave detailed descriptions of incidents that had occurred beginning when Anne was 9 years old and continuing until an attempted rape at 14 years old. Specific locations and actions were described, likely to the mortification of Anne, her husband, and her parents. She then explained that the final incident had happened when Anne was at the Green's house. She explained that Green asked Anne, quote, to walk out with him, that as they were walking by a stack of boards, Charles took a board off of it, laid the board on the ground, threw the said Anne on it, and pulled up her clothes, pulled down his breeches, uncovered his nakedness, and fell on her. When Anne threatened to cry out to a servant man who was at some distance, he desisted from his attempt. Additionally, Anne reported to her stepmother that both before and after the last attempt, the said Charles told the said Anne that there was no such thing as a woman having her maidenhead after 16 or 18. Green employs 3 strategies in his defense. First, he questions why Anne waited so long to tell anyone of his alleged abuse and why the Fairfax and Washington families waited so long to prosecute such heinous crimes. He insists this hiatus indicates the story's untrue. He defends himself by blaming Anne, stating that even as a child, she was lascivious and forward and was always a liar. His final strategy is to assert that her sexualized behavior is akin to that of a Negro woman. We see this in his question directed to Green's sister-in-law. Did you ever know anything of her wanton behavior and observe of it to her in regard to Negro women? It's important to understand this in the context of how race and racial identity were understood at this time. In 1745, race was viewed as fluid and shaped by environment, not grounded necessarily in biology. As Katie Childs explains, to say that the racialized body was believed to be malleable is to say that race was not essentialized in the same way that it would be in the 19th century. It is not to say that characteristics were not assigned to bodies understood as a particular race. In Green's question, sex functions as a contingent process to define race, and thus to define Anne as both inappropriately sexual and Negro. Yet Green's race baiting has some teeth to it that many in the community are likely unaware of. While Anne was living a privileged life, she was very likely a woman of color. Her deceased mother, Sarah Walker Fairfax, was said to have been a biracial woman born in the Bahamas to a British officer and a free African woman. Deborah, her stepmother, is white, as are Deborah's 3 children by birth. Anne, like her older brothers George and Thomas and her sister Sarah, is living a life shaped by wealth and status that creates the perception of whiteness. There are no existing images of Anne, as far as I know, though we can guess that she was probably fairly light-skinned. There's an image of an extremely pale woman called Ann Fairfax that is used in genealogy websites to represent her. It's actually her grandmother, who was white. There's no definitive evidence I'm aware of that Sarah Walker Fairfax was Black, but there are several indications in family letters that support this interpretation. Well, that's a picture of her father. And this is her stepmother. Importantly, the trial papers provide more evidence, and in my view, even suggest that Green's knowledge of Anne's mixed race status may have provided him with self-justification for his offensive actions. Annette Gordon Reed's important work focuses on the politics of sex across racial lines in regards to white men and enslaved Black and mixed race women. Yet her insights about the way such unions were justified speak to broader interactions between white men and women of color in the 18th century. She says, giving a group of males total dominion over the bodies of a group of females and relying on externally imposed notions of race, I'm superior to her and I'm a gentleman, to prevent them from having sex with those females was always a doomed proposition. That the mixing could be done entirely on the terms of the males beyond the eyes and the scrutiny of the outside world only increased the odds that it would happen. Well, Reverend Green did not have dominion over Ann Fairfax in the way he would have had over women he enslaved. His sense of impunity in violating her bodily integrity is consistent. He did not own her, yet his authority as a minister and a close friend of her father's provided a cover for Green's actions. Indeed, as the work of Kathleen M. Brown makes clear, the development of race-based slavery in Virginia fundamentally altered gender relations in the 18th century. Green indicates in his deposition that he knows the older Fairfax children are Negro. He raises the issue of childhood sexuality by distinguishing the behavior of the Negro children in the family from the white children. He says, oops, sorry. How much younger than Mrs. Washington is Miss Sally? Declare, did she complain when Negro Moses attempted her? Declare what you know. How many in the family have been accused of attempts, if not George Fairfax, when a child? Every Negro child of attempts on each other. Green asked this question concerning when Negro Moses attempted her and the ages of Anne and her younger sister Sally several times throughout the trial as he deploys associations of Negroes with uncontrolled sexuality in his efforts to discredit Anne. His questions about Moses's attempts, and this is the language that's used repeatedly throughout the trial transcript, is attempts, excuse me, to suggest that this was an attempt of rape or debauchement similar to the attempts Green is charged with against Anne. Yet Deborah's testimony makes clear that this story was about the attempt of an enslaved child to kiss Anne when she was about 8 years old. The story is reportedly the subject of widespread gossip in Virginia and Maryland, and Green has offered money to publish his story in a Pennsylvania newspaper. Deborah Fairfax learns from a family member returning to Belvoir from the Williamsburg area that it was a universal whisper throughout the country that a Black man had tried to seduce Anne. Green deploys the tactic of associating Anne with the loose sexuality he and others of that time associate with Black women. He also makes clear in the quote above that he acknowledges that Fairfax's children with Sarah Walker Fairfax are Negro by distinguishing the children, quote, in the family who have been accused of attempts as every Negro child. He specifically mentions George Fairfax, who's the oldest of William Fairfax's and Sarah Walker's children. As I've discussed, racial identity was a contingent process. Public stories about women of color, often referred to as Black Venuses in that era, narrate them as wanton and licentious temptresses of white men. Because racial identity in the 18th century is not understood as fixed, there's an understanding that whiteness must be continually maintained, and loose sexuality is a signifier of Blackness. Green successfully deploys the sexually licentious Black Venus story, without naming it as such, to blame Anne by racializing and sexualizing her. Green's words dominate the trial papers. He shapes the narrative profoundly through his defense. His perspective is reasserted again and again in his prepared questions for those testifying. His questions prompt Anne not only to reiterate what happened, but to repudiate his version of her words. Instead of emphasizing his crimes, she's forced to defend her own honor and honesty, as well as clarify what she's actually accused him of. He repeatedly asks questions about a supposed claim that she believed she was with child, requiring Anne to clarify that she never claimed such a thing. He manipulates the accusations in a way that makes them more outrageous than what she actually claimed. This accomplishes several goals. First, it blows up the accusations in a way that make them seem more likely, more unlikely on his part. And thus dishonest on her part. Yet it also functions in a more insidious way to damn her for sexual impurity that went beyond the claims of her abuse. He puts her in the position of having to reiterate that she was not with child, even under circumstances when he's only accused of attempted rape. I discussed at the opening of my remarks the letter from Charles Green to William Fairfax, in which Green admits to being guilty of some indiscretions with Anne. Because the letter had been burned to protect her reputation, it could not be entered into testimony. Yet Green also admitted to attempts in his questions to Anne in court, in which he asked, "Have I made any attempts on you since June, July, August, September, October, November, December 1742? Did you complain of me when those attempts were made?" This seems a blatant admission that indeed he had made attempts. Yet this is ignored by the court. Annette Gordon-Reed makes clear that while there were admonitions against sex between whites and blacks, Virginia in the 18th century was set up for such things to happen, with a much touted but essentially weak barrier to prevent it. The pervasive doctrine of white supremacy supposedly inoculated whites against the will to interracial mixing, but that doctrine proved to be unreliable when matched against the force of human sexuality. Through a dramatic case is settled by Virginia Governor Gooch, he dismissed the case. Greene's defense of blaming the victims is successful, and he retains his position as rector of Truro Parish for the remaining 20 years of his life. Henriquez suggests that the clash between Washington and Greene is a classic study of the struggle between the squire and the parson, explaining that the ostensible reason for the ecclesiastical trial of Charles Greene was his attempted debauchery of Ann Fairfax. The degree of his guilt is debatable. Yet if this were Greene's only crime, the trial would never have been held. One essential reason for the trial was to assert planter hegemony and to punish a clergyman who challenged it. Clearly, the trial was about power, yet about more than planter hegemony. In my view, the case against Greene is convincing, and I argue, in fact, that the power relations being played out in this trial were articulated primarily on the body of Ann Fairfax Washington. As Kathleen M. Brown explains, during this high-water mark of planter authority, elite men derived their power from 5 main sources: land ownership, control over sexual access to women, rights to the labor of slaves and servants, formal access to political life, and the ability to create and manipulate symbols signifying these other sources of power. Aspects of all of these were at play in this trial, yet the intersections of gender, sex, and race are explicitly denied in the analysis within the trial papers, in Governor Gooch's dismissal of the case, and in Henriquez's analysis. Henriquez accepts Reverend Greene's defense that it didn't make sense that the Fairfax and Washingtons would have prosecuted him for a crime that happened 2.5 years prior. He also accepts Greene's version of the delicate relationship between Charles Greene and Ann Fairfax, questioning why an affectionate relationship would continue between them even after he had sexually violated her. Henriquez does not address the issue of race at all. He highlights the fact that, quote, in the governor's settlement, Greene was rebuked, not for sexual misconduct with Ann Washington, but rather for his actions toward Fairfax and Washington. The men that weigh in here all seem to agree that Ann's behavior is somewhat suspect. We know from contemporary scholars of sexual assault and abuse that trauma leads people to behave in ways that others often do not understand. Part of how sexual abusers of children typically operate is through grooming and manipulation. Children are often lured into complex and confusing situations and then threatened with exposure of their inherent sin or perversion, depending on the circumstances. We see in the trial papers that Greene was manipulative of Ann's emotions, suggesting that he was her only true friend and she could not trust anyone else. This is classic grooming behavior, and while we must guard against applying contemporary understandings of human sexuality and beliefs, it seems clear from the language used to defend Greene and to blame Ann that not much has changed in the language employed to understand sexual assault in the intervening almost 300 years. Sharon Block's research on sexual assault in the 18th century usefully makes clear that, quote, rape in early America was both pervasive and invisible. Indeed, I would suggest that a social function of this specific story is to deny its believability. Indeed, Block argues that the very absence of recorded categorizations of such acts as rape was crucial to early American systems of sexual and social power. Making violations invisible in the public record maintains ideologies of patriarchy and white supremacy and supports narratives of gallant white gentlemen protecting innocent white ladies. The official dismissal of the case was essentially a denial of Green's guilt and erasure of Anne Washington's lived experience. In my view, the dismissal of the case and the burial of the trial papers in the archive functioned to achieve similar goals: to maintain mythologies of American history that seek to elevate our founders and perpetuate narratives celebrating their honor and integrity. Indeed, Enriquez basically asked how this could be true when George Washington had a continued relationship with Green after this. The invisibility of rape in acceptable public discussion serves to obscure attention to the ways it functions as what Foucault calls a dense transfer point of power. As Bloch explains, rape's repeated appearance in American red fiction, myth, and political propaganda reveals that despite comparatively low levels of prosecutions, it held a prominent place in the early American psyche. Rape could condemn villains, mark racial differences, or demean political enemies. We have only to look at the history of white men raping enslaved women to recognize that sex was a site of interaction in which unequal power relations were frequently exercised. As Bloch says, men's racial and class identities largely determined whether they could coerce sex undetected and unpunished, just as women's identities determined their vulnerability to men's sexual force. Anne's body was marked by the microphysics of power. As he inscribed her body sexually, he inscribed it racially with his words. His words, many, many, many words, are well preserved in the archive, while hers are not. Her story haunts the outlines of stories told and untold by countless girls and women in the almost 3 centuries since these events. These stones are the ruins of Anne's childhood home. They mark out the footprint of her home, what is reputed to have been one of the grandest mansions in Virginia. There are no extant images of it, but conjectural drawings based on detailed descriptions have been created, and this is one right here. Belvoir was destroyed by fire in the 18th century, and the brick remains were further destroyed by cannon fire in the War of 1812. Yet these are just the surface stones. The site has been partially excavated several times. Here we have a 1932 archaeological investigation. Here we have 1960 surveying wall remnants. There was a full archaeological dig in the 1970s, and each time it's been filled in order to preserve the ruins. This is a colorized version of a photo of a 1920s excavation of Belvoir Mansion. Like the record of Anne's testimony, even the ruins are buried here. As Sadia Hartman says, this is a history written with and against the archive. What myths and ideologies of American history are challenged by this story? Patriarchal power produces social narratives about men of honor protecting the racial and sexual purity of their women as they protect their nation. It was not so long ago that enslaved people were referred to as servants in historical texts. Race, sex, gender, and class all shape what is considered important to preserve for history, as well as whose lived experiences and stories about it matter. We know that the dearth of information about the lives of enslaved people is attributable to racial ideologies in that era as well as those that followed. Sharon Bloch explains, such holes in extant records are a fact of a historian's life, but the preservation of certain kinds of records regarding sexual coercion is not mere happenstance. Ideologies of race, gender, class, and social standing shaped whose words were taken down and preserved for posterity, and ultimately, whose perspectives on rape have become representative of early American society. We know that Anne's testimony is missing from the archive. We don't know at what point it disappeared. Yet there are other factors contributing to the burial of this story. In 1917, when the Library of Congress purchased the papers of Reverend William Dawson, who had presided over the trial, they were, as Henriquez explained, accessioned in a way as to make it more difficult for professional historians to discover them. The trial records were separated from the Dawson papers and closed to researchers for nearly 50 years. When they were finally made available, they were incorrectly cataloged as the papers of the accused clergyman Charles Green rather than those of William Dawson. Henriquez basically discovered these papers by accident while trying to research something else. We must consider what shaped each step of this process. To what extent was this burial about erasing from history a controversial story connected to the family of George Washington? I think I page stuck together. Okay, yep. To believe Ann Fairfax Washington, the first mistress of Mount Vernon, was a biracial woman that was sexually abused by a parish minister is, in a sense, to believe in ghost stories. As I stand at what may have been the front steps of Belvoir Mansion, Anne's childhood home, I'm haunted by her story and how profoundly similar it is to contemporary rape trials in which women are so commonly vilified for their actions. The defense mounted by Reverend Green is precisely the sort of defense proffered by men accused of sexual assault in the contemporary moment. As Avery Gordon writes, to write about invisibilities and hauntings requires attention to what is not seen, but is nonetheless powerfully real. Requires attention to what appears dead, but is nonetheless powerfully alive. Requires attention to what appears to be in the past, but is nonetheless powerfully present. Requires attention to just who the subject of analysis is. How could the story have failed to be forgotten? It was too disruptive of the social order to be remembered. The people that witnessed and participated, the Fairfaxes, the Washingtons, all of their neighbors, etc., had to let the story be buried in order to continue believing in the ways of their social world. The site of the Belvoir Mansion ruins is on Fort Belvoir, an army base with restrictive visitation rules. In order to visit, I had to be escorted or sponsored by military or government personnel. I have to thank Stephen for setting that up for me. The ruins exist off to the side of the daily workings of the base, hidden behind security walls and a gate just south of Mount Vernon. It sits on a bluff that would have stunning views of the Potomac River if the trees weren't overgrown. In its glory, it was one of the grandest mansions in Virginia and now sits on the edge of a military base where only residents have open access to the historical markers, ruins of the mansion, and the surrounding trial. The site's been excavated several times and filled in after each dig, so the ruins are just stone outlines of the foundation, the surrounding stone fence, and the outbuildings. These are the ruins of Anne's childhood home, the place she married Lawrence Washington, yet also the location of many of the attempts on her by Reverend Green. It's where she lived her life, kept her secrets, and shared them when the burden was too much. I argue that the story can be read as an allegory of power, exercised through regulatory practices focused on sex, gender, race, and class. The shameful victim blaming evidenced in this case and the shocking things this man said about this young woman resonate over the almost 300 years since the trial. These stories ring true, and we must consider the extent to which this familiarity is connected to why we don't know this story. How many experiences like this have happened before that we know nothing about? To what extent are such narratives of young women abused by the system that should protect them pushed to the side, erased, buried, so that the mythology of men's honor and women's purity can be maintained? The intersection of whiteness with purity and sexual innocence is maintained and regulated through romanticized views of history that continue to shape contemporary politics. Thank you. This image here is, you can see on the right here, there's a panel at the ruin site. And it says, if you stand here, you can see what the mansion looked like. So I thought that was very cool. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I thought it was enlightening, and it's so true. That's happened so many times throughout history, all over the world, actually. I'm interested on two things. One is, how did she become a Lee? That's the first thing. And then what happened to her after?
Yeah, I didn't really have time to give all of those details, but Lawrence Washington dies in 1751 of tuberculosis, or what we think was probably tuberculosis. Shortly after that, she marries George Lee. Their 4-year-old daughter, they have thought for a long time that Anne and Lawrence had 4 children, none of which survived. They think now, I found evidence that it sounds like there were 5. There was one child living still named Sarah when Lawrence died, and he left Mount Vernon to her. If she were to not survive, Anne would have a lifetime interest in the plantation, and at her death, it would go to George. So that's how he ended up here. He rented it from her and George Lee while they were still alive. She married George Lee, went down to live in Westmoreland, and had 3 children. So she gave birth to 8 children, and only 3 survived. The last 3 with George did survive and, continued on with this family and so forth. She died about 10 years after Lawrence, 11 technically, in 1762. I can only imagine that this took a toll on her life, as giving birth to 8 children and losing 5 of them would as well. So she and her sister died of breast cancer right before she did. Her sister actually married John Carlyle, and who built the Carlyle House for her, which is in Alexandria, which is another wonderful historical site to visit. So that's her legacy.
I'm not sure I understand why Lawrence Washington took this to public trial. Can you go over that again?
That's one of the big questions. Henriquez really believes that Lawrence Washington and William Fairfax did this because they were angry they had not been appointed to the vestry of Truro Parish. There are politics around the parish and the vestrymen and the power and all of these things. But I cannot quite buy into that is what was really going on. The timing may very well have had something to do with that. But in my view, the timing is very much about making sure that Anne was married before the accusations came out, because she needed to be seen as an acceptable lady. Her father and stepmother did not want to prosecute, wanted to keep it quiet. She says in her second testimony that she told Lawrence. We don't know if Lawrence knew beforehand or not, but she told Lawrence. So I can only imagine, and what we get from his letters are that he's furious and this is horrific and he wants justice. So, there are questions about the gap in time. It was over a year after they got married before he sent this letter. But it does appear from the language of the letter that he writes to Reverend William Dawson that he wasn't planning on making this a public event. He just wanted this man to go away. Then, of course, Green wasn't having that.
Thank you. This is great research.
Thank you.
I'm a researcher on Belvoir myself.
Oh.
So I know that there have been questions about George William Fairfax's racial makeup also, with letters from Sally Fairfax going back and forth. Do you know if there have ever been any questions about the Carlisle children, and if anyone has tried to follow up with the Lee children to see if there have been any questions about their race?
There is almost nothing on the Lees. She just kind of goes into obscurity at that point. George wasn't a real important Lee, apparently. But so I don't have any, I have not seen anything about that. And I have not seen anything about the Carlisle children question either. But I mean, I have to kind of chuckle a little bit because the current Lord Fairfax, who, at some point in the 19th century, one of them that was descended decided, I'm going to go back and claim this for real. He went back, Albert Kirby Fairfax went back and was established as the Lord Fairfax. And now there's a current one who serves in, whatever the houses they serve in. They are directly descended from Sarah Fairfax, Carlisle. That family is descended from a Black woman. And, the brother of the current Lord Fairfax wrote a book about the family a couple of years ago, and there is not a single word about race.
Right. But
It's not a great book anyway. But
do we have evidence that Sarah Walker Fairfax was mixed race?
we do not know for sure.
Yeah.
And I do want to go to the Bahamas and see if I can find out anything, but everything that I've read suggests it.
Right.
And the evidence in here, I think, really sort of puts a cap on what the letters
It
show.
definitely adds to the body of knowledge. So
Yeah.
I'm appreciative to know about those records. That's very helpful. We'd love to have an answer.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I've really learned a lot. And I wanted to ask you about this wonderful story map that you've been showing us. Is this publicly available? Is this something that you're still adding to? And sort of how do you envision this being used? Do you see it as a classroom tool, maybe? I guess I want to know about your plans for the
Sure.
digital project.
This is now public. I ended up, publishing it and making it public. It's just on the ArcGIS website. I will be continuing to add to this. I want it to be a much, fuller thing. I'll use more maps too. There's an amazing amount of functionality on these kind of story maps. You can do all kinds of stuff. So I will continue to build that. I have a website that I use where I put up student projects and I put up my own work and so forth. So I previously did one about Sarah Walker Fairfax and another woman not related to this family who were sort of that same era. It was also a mixed race or purported to be mixed race woman. And that's up on my website. So, and I've had students do projects on this as well. I have, I set up basically like Google Drives with mini archives. And they choose a topic and they go and say, oh, I'm going to look at Ann Fairfax Washington today, or, for my project. And they draw on those things and use the original documents and create these kind of things. So.
First of all, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation and really terrific research, and the way you told the story. I was like, this should be a movie. This is a really great story. Would you mind sharing how you're obviously a relative newcomer to early American history, and do you mind sharing with the audience how you came to this story?
Oh, sure. About 7 years ago, when I was on my last sabbatical, I needed a brain break. And I thought, I really like genealogy. Let me just kind of dig in and see what's up with my family. And I had done little bits here and there for years and years and years. And so my grandmother had said to me, and she was no longer alive 7 years ago, but she had said this many years ago. She said, yes, Aunt Bird and Aunt Bell always said we were related to the Fairfaxes, or that we were descended from Lord Fairfax, but I didn't believe them because he didn't have any children. So, Lord Fairfax, Thomas, the sixth Lord Fairfax, who had inherited the 5 million acres, did not have children. There were other Lord Fairfaxes after that, and in fact, we are quite descended from them. But the point of pride in my family was that my grandmother's great-grandfather had served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And in fact, his older brother had been a rear admiral, and there was the USS Fairfax had been named for him because of his actions in the Trent affair. And this was a huge point of pride, and this was the history in our family. And we must have always lived in Pennsylvania and always been Northerners, was my take on it. And so when she said that, I thought, well, isn't that interesting? So I started digging around, and I found an article that was written by a researcher at PBS a number of years ago that I think is probably the first article that introduced this idea of these people were probably biracial. And so I started reading that, and then I was really hooked because my research has always been about race. My children are biracial. This is my area. And I was like, oh my God. So I start digging and digging and digging. And I discovered there's this public website called WikiTree that's like, it's kind of like ancestry.com, but it's free and it's more accurate. And so I knew my great-great-grandfather's name. And once I was able to find his connection through his brother, the rear admiral, etc., and I hooked them into WikiTree, and all of a sudden, there was this vast history of family going back to God, basically. So I discovered that, in fact, we were descended from Lord Fairfax, directly descended from Lord Brian Fairfax, who was William and Sarah's and Anne's younger brother, half-brother. So basically, my take on my family story was that I do know that they were the only two members of the Fairfax family to go north and fight for the Union Army. There were many, many, many members of the Fairfax family who fought for the Confederates. And I'm assuming they were ashamed of their slaveholding family's past and didn't tell their descendants about it. So...
questions?
I saw some special a few years ago on PBS that this is an issue even today, the sexualization of young African American girls and teens.
Absolutely.
Even in this day and age by leading African American feminists, and it's still a problem. And even in the 60s and 70s, rape victims were blamed of enticing the rapist. I think the best solution was Lawrence should have hired two thugs to break Reverend James' legs and not go to court.
Right.
And then he would have thought twice about doing that again to any other young woman.
It is absolutely still with us. And that's one of the things that I find so disturbing and so striking about this is what he said about her is not changed at all. We still have the same stories defending men.
I just have a comment. I was just wondering what that conversation was like with her husband.
Right?
You know, how do you bring that up? You know, and I agree with you to wonder, he probably had heard some things, but I'm wondering really what that conversation could have been like to be in her status that she was in, and not just because she was a Negro woman, but she was just a woman in general, just to bring that up from someone in the clergy. And I'm sure the remnants of the gossip had been going on about him as well, because she probably was not the only one.
Oh,
in
I'm
reality.
sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much.